From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Primary voters go to the polls in Georgia, Texas, Alabama, and points beyond. What to look for as the returns start coming in tonight. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board members Alicia Finley and Kate Batchelder-Odell. Let's start in the great state of Georgia, where the highest profile races seem to be grudge matches being waged by former President Trump, who continues to maintain that he should have won Georgia in his 2020 re-election campaign. So to start, the incumbent governor there is Republican Brian Kemp. The Trump-backed challenger is David Perdue, who is a former senator. He lost his seat in those 2021 runoffs. But what's interesting is Vice President Mike Pence was in Georgia this week, and he's campaigning for Brian Kemp. So we have three clips here. First, we'll start with a bit of Mike Pence, then Trump's reaction to his VP, and then Brian Kemp saying that he has no beef with President Trump.
There are those who want to make this election about the past. Stacey Abrams and Joe Biden want Georgia to embrace the failed socialist policies of the last century. They want to stifle the liberties that generations of Americans have fought to defend. But you know the future belongs to freedom. And when you say yes to Governor Brian Kemp tomorrow, you will send a deafening message all across America that the Republican Party is the party of the future.
Very disappointed in Mike, as a lot of people are, and he just very greatly disappointed me. He had a great opportunity, and all he had to do is send it back to the legislatures, let them decide. Because when you had all of that ammunition, when you had all of those things being said about the election, and you had all of the proof that Peter Navarro and others, many others, were talking about, it would have been very easy to send it back and have them come back. So I'm very disappointed at at the stance he took.
He's mad at me. I'm not mad at him. So that's something I can't control. I haven't tried to control anything outside of what I can control, and that's what I'm going to continue to do. I think Republicans are going to unite after tomorrow, but, we'll wait and see how that plays out. But regardless, I'm going to continue doing the same things I've been doing.
Alicia, what do you make of this pileup here, this proxy war that President Trump appears to be trying to wage against Republican officials who did not support him strongly enough, in his view, after the 2020 election?
I'm not really even sure that the Trump endorsements or anti-endorsements are really going to play a major role in the Georgia primary. I think Republican voters are largely happy with Brian Kemp's, performance as governor. Unemployment is at 3.1% on almost, all-time low. The state's one of the fastest growing in the country in terms of populations. He did a pretty good job of keeping the state open while other states were locking down. And so really his economic record, and I know you've written about this, the voting legislation that the Republicans passed to secure ballot integrity, I think he has a lot of good things to run on. And I'm not even sure that the Trump vote or the Trump anti-endorsement is going to be a major factor here. Well,
incumbency is important. Brian Kemp has the power to sign legislation, and not only the voting bill that we've discussed, but last month he signed a bill allowing constitutional carry of firearms, so he can go out talking about the stuff that he's doing. But Kate, I also have a theory of why the Trump endorsements maybe are playing in Georgia a little bit different than they are in some other states like Ohio and Pennsylvania. And one reason might be that these Republican voters watched what happened in those January 2021 runoffs immediately after the 2020 election. And President Trump came to town. He was talking about voter fraud. Republican voters seemed to be disenthused by that. And Republicans lost those two Senate seats, lost control of the Senate as a result of that. And so maybe that's part of why these endorsements are playing differently in Georgia, is the Georgia Republican voters are saying, well, we just did that song and dance and it didn't work out very well.
And don't forget, Kyle, they did it with David Perdue, right, who lost to John Ossoff in what should have been a winnable race for him. So I do think there's some of that going on, but I also think that voters are just revealing they are more sophisticated than they're often given credit for. They make distinctions about candidates and endorsements. And I think that's a lot of what is going on here. I mean, one thing that Pence said that we didn't play was, I'm here because Brian Kemp is the only candidate in tomorrow's primary who has already defeated Stacey Abrams, whether she knows it or not, he added as as a light joke, but I think the electorate is focused on they want to win the race, and it is a toss-up, so they need a candidate that can beat Stacey Abrams. Brian Kemp has done that. And they also may no longer want to relitigate the 2020 election, having been satisfied with what Kemp did to make people more confident in elections. And they may now have moved on to issues like inflation that are really much higher on their priority list of things to vote on. So what we're seeing here is a lot of people, a lot of voters who like Trump and voted for him are going to vote for Kemp because they're largely happy with him.
And the polls show that Kemp is up by double digits. I think the Real Clear Politics average of polls now shows him up by about 20 points with 54.7% of the vote to Perdue's 35.3%. And Alicia, in Georgia, the magic number is 50% because if Kemp gets above that, then he wins outright. And if he's below that, then he has to go to a runoff. And so it will be interesting to see if he can get this done in one shot. And if he does, then the race that maybe will show even more about whether these Trump endorsements are having an effect is the Republican primary for Secretary of State. And there the incumbent is Brad Raffensperger. The Trump-backed challenger is Congressman Jody Hice. And there it seems a little less clear. There's fewer polls on it, and they seem to move around more than the Kemp-Perdue polls. So there's one last month. If you're filling out your Republican primary ballot today, who would you vote for? Jody Hice gets 20%, Brad Raffensperger gets 31%, and undecided gets 40%, which is a huge number. And Alicia, that suggests that this election tonight really could go either way.
I think that's right. People don't really usually pay attention to the down ballot races like Secretary of State. In this case, it's really only prominent because Trump has lashed out against Raffensperger, has kind of actually increased his name recognition in the state. But I think he will benefit from the incumbent advantage. I mean, people who aren't terribly familiar with the feud between Trump are still, I think, likely to vote for him versus Jody Hice, who they probably also aren't terribly familiar with either. And again, note that these are usually low-cost, low-budget races, and it's very difficult for contenders or challengers to make an impact without spending a lot of money. So here I think the incumbency advantage is actually even greater than in the governor's race.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I also think that Raffensperger has benefited from defending the Georgia election law that passed last year. I mean, he didn't put his signature on it the way that Brian Kemp did, but it allowed him to, I think, make up some of that ground and show that he really does want secure elections, election integrity. As they say, you know, one thing that he was calling for is New York passed some legislation recently to let non-citizens vote in local elections. And Brad Raffensperger came out and called for a constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution to require citizenship to vote. And so, Kate, that's the other thing that is interesting. The dynamic here, I think, is Raffensperger is not exactly a squish on these questions, you know, whether changes needed to be made to Georgia's election law. He has defended the new law and said that it will make things more secure. He just has not suffered gladly these Baroque fraud theories about 2020. In the Journal, we had an op-ed from him in 2020 that this was the headline: Trump runs the Stacey Abrams playbook. Evidence-free charges of election fraud are corrosive no matter who makes them. Unquote. And so, that's not an argument for making it easier, but it is an argument that clearly made President Trump upset.
Yeah, Kyle, and one thing I'd add to that, too, is that it really did take some mettle to defend that voting law after the President of the United States came to Georgia and called it Jim Crow 2.0. I mean, the attacks were really vicious on that voting law, even though, as you've written pretty extensively, you know, there was a longer earlier voting period than a lot of blue states. It was hardly a measure aimed at suppressing voters. The other thing I would add, too, is that I think that the process, we're getting back to seeing more of how people voted before the pandemic. I mean, part of 2020 was conducting this huge mail-in voting experiment during a pandemic, and now we're starting to see that people are going back to the polls, and the process appears to be running relatively smoothly on Tuesday. And so I think Raffensperger will get some credit for that as well.
Well, the voting numbers, the turnout numbers are also something to keep an eye on, particularly in Georgia, I think, because of all of the allegations made against this law. And so far, the early voting is blowing previous elections out of the water. If you compare the early voting and absentee voting numbers this year to 2018 or 2020. And Alicia, we don't quite know what's going on there, if that's increased turnout, which would seem to cut against the voter suppression arguments, or whether that's a continuation of these trends where people voted by mail maybe for the first time in 2020 during the pandemic, and they kind of liked it. And they told their friends and their neighbors and their spouses that they kind of liked it. And so there may also be that kind of a shift going on. And so we won't know for sure what the overall turnout is until we get numbers tonight. We also won't know how many absentee ballots were rejected, if the ID numbers on them were mismatched. So there will be a couple of days, I think, until we get all of those figures sorted out and in line. But it's possible, Alicia, that we will have some pretty good voting numbers that make the Georgia law even more defensible than it was previously.
Right. So I think, a lot of factors go into voting turnout and motivation beyond just the ease of or the ballot access. Here, I think, it's the quality of the candidates, the general enthusiasm, the political environment. Republicans are actually much more revved up this year than they were in 2018. Democrats less so. I think the real actual test will be in November and how that compares to the November 2018 election. And my guess that the voter turnout will actually be higher, in part because, the Democrats have also kind of used this myth of voter suppression to try to energize their base. They do this all the time. And the law really hasn't suppressed the vote, and it's made it maybe modestly more difficult than it was in 2020 to cast ballots, but that doesn't constitute voter suppression or the Voting Rights Act, to your point. So again, I think let's see what happens tonight, and let's see what happens in November.
Hang tight, we'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. There's also some voting going on in Texas. These are runoffs, and one that I would pull out is Congressman Henry Cuellar, and he is facing off with a former intern of his, 28-year-old Jessica Cisneros, and she's a progressive. She has the backing of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She wants policies like Medicare for All. And Congressman Cuellar is a little bit more middle of the road. Some of the reports on this race say that he's the last pro-life Democrat in the House, or the last anti-abortion Democrat in the House, however you want to phrase it. And so, Kate, this is another example, it seems to me, of these races. There's one in Oregon, there's one in Pennsylvania, where the sort of middle of the road Democrats are potentially being pushed out by very progressive figures. And it suggests to me that this question of polarization is not just going along in the Republican Party, but it's really happening on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, it definitely is, Kyle. There are some unique features about this particular race, one of which is Cuellar had his home raided, but it appears to be an FBI investigation that he's not the subject of. But sometimes the specter of that can be hard to overcome. But it has become a race that I think his progressive opponent has tried to make about abortion in the last few weeks, given the leak of the draft opinion that could potentially overturn Roe v. Wade. To the extent that the race has become more about abortion, I'm not sure that that helps his progressive challenger as much as she might think. We've seen some flooding in with money from Emily's lists and advertisements and other pro-abortion groups. But I do think that could really backfire if Cuellar's position represents the district better than his challenger's does. I mean, keep in mind, this is a largely Hispanic district and may also thus be more conservative. And in primaries, those tend to also be the people who are voting. So there was a poll out from 2018, a little old now, saying that Hispanics in Texas are less likely than other Americans to say they believe abortion should be legal in all cases. 53% said it should be illegal in most or all cases. So the position here of his progressive challenger really may not reflect the district. And so that could potentially backfire on her. And she's been calling Cuellar the Joe Manchin of the House, but that could potentially work for him, unlike some other districts, if voters perceive that he is a reasonable, moderate politician who represents their interests well. I mean, he's been talking about how he's been sort of pushed out of the party, even though he has Clyburn and Pelosi and other Democratic leaders campaigning for him. So I think this will be a really interesting race to watch, but maybe not for the reasons that some of the progressives are hoping.
Another Texas race to keep an eye on is the Attorney General, Ken Paxton. He's in a runoff against George P. Bush. That is the grandson of the original president, George H.W. Bush, the nephew of George W. Bush, and the son of Jeb Bush, for those keeping track at home. He is the state land commissioner. And Paxton, Alicia, has had some scandal issues of his own. But do you think that is going to be enough to put George Bush over the top here? Or are we in a populist moment where it's not really all that helpful to be named George Bush?
I think the latter. And I think Paxton has really energized his base with a lot of these lawsuits against the Biden administration. Some of them, I would argue, are somewhat dubious. And actually going back before the Biden administration, recall he was the one who sued to overturn DACA under Trump, which kind of forced a reckoning there in the Supreme Court. And a bad precedent, I might add, because essentially, if you recall, Trump ended up pulling back DACA under Paxton's threats. And as a result, the Supreme Court ended up ruling that the government can't rescind a policy that was unlawful without providing more APA Administrative Procedures Act guidance. And so now we still have DACA in effect, and Paxton says has sued again to overturn that. I'm not sure that is winning strategy or legal political strategy for Republicans across the country. But I think it plays well in Texas, and is similar with the Obamacare lawsuit that he launched in 2018, or actually earlier, to overturn Obamacare. Again, it really kind of helped energize his base, but again, it lost at the Supreme Court and was a liability for Republicans going into the 2018 midterms. I have to worry that that's something similar will happen if he gets reelected, that he could, I don't want to call it a kamikaze mission, but it could take another politically motivated lawsuit that's somewhat legally dubious, could hurt some Republicans in future elections.
One final race that I would point out is the Alabama Senate election, and there you have an interesting dynamic because President Trump originally endorsed Congressman Mo Brooks for that seat, and then Brooks seemed to be struggling to get traction, and President Trump unendorsed him, and now it looks like Brooks is surging again. In the Real Clear Politics average here, he has about 29%, and that's compared to the candidate on top, 35%. And this is another one of those states where there may potentially be a runoff. So you could end up with, Kate, a candidate who Trump endorsed and then unendorsed, potentially winning this race.
Yes, Kyle. So you see in Alabama, we have a three-way race, and we have another candidate, an Army veteran named Mike Durant, who's polling in the mid-20s as well. So we've got a split here, and potentially we'll get to a runoff if no one clears 50%. So we've seen also that Katie Britt, who is leading the polls currently, has been painted as sort of a lobbyist, or the Alabama Liz Cheney, as one ad calls her. So we've seen there that this might split the vote a little bit. But I think similar to what we were seeing in Georgia, we're seeing voters make some distinctions where some voters who like Trump have decided to select their own candidate. I would also add that the fallout between Mo Brooks and Trump seems to be over a more minor, hard to follow dispute there than some of the larger breaks like the one in Georgia where Kemp was dismissing his election claims. So I think maybe perhaps Mo Brooks is retaining more committed Trump voters as well.
But Alicia, what do you make of this idea that we've been discussing about whether, as President Trump is eyeing 2024, whether he is playing somewhat of a risky game with some of these endorsements, and he's endorsing a lot of candidates who are unchallenged or they're not facing real strong challengers. And so his win-loss record by the numbers may look pretty good, but in some of these cases, he's endorsing a gubernatorial candidate who looks like he's not going to win. He's endorsing and then unendorsing a guy who could be the next senator from Alabama. Alicia, do you think that he is creating some political headaches for himself if President Trump really wants to get back in a game in 2024? And we'll give you the last word.
I think he's trying to stay relevant by making these endorsements. And obviously, Trump just can't help himself, and he likes to be at the center of attention. So he's inserting himself into these races where, are really probably about local issues and the candidates. So I don't think he's really helping himself there. But I also think the Trump populist appeal, not Trump himself, but this populist uproar that he ignited back in 2016, I think that's still, flaming pretty strong across the country. And that's partly a response to the left, the progressive and woke policies. So what I think the current moment is less about Trump and the continued populist reaction to the excesses of the progressive left.
Thank you, Alicia and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.